Okay, we did a new thing yesterday. This is a new thing today. Welcome to what we're calling Merely Human Life Dialogues. My first life dialogue, my first interview, my first conversation will be with Dr. Steve Jacobs. So I just want to get started right away. So here's what we're going to cover today so that everybody can understand. Eventually, we're going to go from how you went from the guy we've talked a little bit about, and I want to hear more about that as far as your background personally, to the guy who went to apparently every prestigious university in the Chicago area to get their degrees, and then became, after that PhD, a guy that I am quoting all the time. I mean, your name comes up in almost every talk that I give. So to me, there's so much interesting going on there, from getting going in this area to the path takes you from Northwestern and to get your JD, and then to University of Chicago to get your PhD. And I want to cover every bit of it, but I want to start with some background for the audience, because your name just exploded on the scene like a year ago. And it's important for people to realize, for me, I think it's very important when we go out and we try to teach people, to equip them to be able to handle morally important issues, that they be able not just to trust the information they're given, but to trust the person from whom the information comes. And so I'd like to know more about you. So first of all, let's talk about where you came from and how you start on this path that ultimately leads to, let's say, Northwestern to begin.
Okay, great. So hello to all the viewers. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. My dad was a truck driver. My mom was a server at a restaurant. So I was actually the first from my family to go to college. I started off at a community college, a local city college, and then I ended up finishing up at a state university. So it was pretty humble beginnings. You know, I was, we'll say I did fairly well in school early on, but when I was in university, I became really passionate about ethics. So I
Okay.
took a series of ethics courses in the philosophy department. I was a psychology major, and this one professor, Dan Milsky, um, he I took a series of like 3 ethics courses, and that was when I really started drilling down on what personhood is, what human rights were. And I think there was just one moment in a class when I realized, when we discussed the trajectory of us protecting certain classes of humans, right? So
Mhm.
he made this one story where he talked about how it started off in America as white male landowners, and then it was white males, and then it was males, and then, you know, so he used this traditional almost trope of how we expanded rights to include all humans. And I realized that we had stopped short when it came to fetuses, when it came to
Yeah.
prenatal humans, based on my understanding that, you know, from a biological perspective, if you have human DNA and you're developing in the human life cycle, that you yourself are a human. And I found it interesting that personhood was a concept that was used to in the context of abortion, it was used to exclude some humans. So it was like you're a human non-person, yet we extended personhood to non-humans. So how is an orangutan recognized as a person under Argentinian law, but then a fetus isn't recognized as a human under American law? So that was really the start of it. And I did, right after undergrad, I actually got into University of Chicago's PhD program in comparative human development. And if you want to jump in at any time.
Yeah, no, well, yeah, all I was going to say was I wanted to ask a question after this, but
Sure.
I have been struck by the same thing. And I hear for some people, when evaluating American history, especially when you fall into one of those classes that was dehumanized or in some way diminished from the
Mm-hmm.
very outset, right? For African Americans, it's very difficult to look at the founding of this country as a great thing. And,
Right.
and, and one of the things that I try to point to in conversationally is like you're absolutely correct. There was an evil system, an evil institution that
Mm-hmm.
was a part of the founding. But what was genius there was the declaration that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights.
Right.
And what makes that with the unalienable rights statement so impressive is that what you just described, then you start to see the narrative unfold that as long as we believe that principle, then all of those evils that were present at the founding of this country begin to erode over time. As
Right.
long as there's some place that we can look to and say,
Yeah.
we fall within the category, this group that has been marginalized or dehumanized falls into that category, that
Hmm.
ought to be treated as if they were created equal and endowed by their creator with unalienable rights. They're in that category.
Yeah.
And so there is something impressive as somebody who came into the Christianity actually from the outside and was more of a nihilist. And I didn't believe in objective morality at all. I was one of
Hmm.
those, the strong win. You're looking for the Superman guys.
Yeah.
And so when I came around and started to reflect on those things, that was the genius of America, right? It wasn't the
Mm.
purity of the country at the founding moment. It was
No.
the purity of that principle.
That's such a great point, and that's what has been debated in this 1619 project that is that
Yeah.
right? That just won
Yes.
the Pulitzer. Um, what their argument is essentially that the principles were there, but they weren't being enacted in the way that it should have been.
Yes.
But how nice that the way that they structured was it. The founders. Let's almost set this as our intention. Let's lay the groundwork, and then eventually, once the polity, once the body politic actually got to a point where they could protect all humans, they would. So,
Yeah.
so I mean, really, I mean, if you come at it from an entitled perspective, it's why wasn't it perfect at the time? Why didn't we undo hundreds of years of slavery in a minute? And if you have a gratitude perspective, it's like, well, it's really good that they put that into our Constitution, and it was just a matter of time before people caught up to those ideals.
And thinking of two things there, I think of John Adams and his quest to not
Hmm.
allow his fellow founding fathers to be deified by history, right? I mean, he was somebody who
Right.
actively worked to not let you think of them as anything more than men and women pursuing a particular agenda that was good for all in their mind, grounded in natural law and natural rights. But
Hmm.
he would not allow it. He actively
Oh,
worked, and then
sure.
Abigail Adams afterwards, to make sure that you did not, these guys didn't escape the kind of attention that they ought to get for the kind of people that they were.
Sure.
And then the other thing that I was thinking about, and that when we talk about those principles being there that would ultimately defeat the evil, when you read about Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass was so intentional about
Mm.
attacking the institution of slavery, not just as an evil, but as anti-constitutional, right? He talked
Oh,
about
of
the
course.
genius of the Constitution, and that it was a violation, not just the law of God, but also the principles of the United States of America, to treat other human beings under the law the way that the African slaves are being treated. And so
Yeah.
it's recognizing there was something deeply evil, but also a spark of genius that was given there that allowed evil to be corrected.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, obviously, the power, as Frederick Douglass said, power never lets go, never releases without a fight.
Sure.
But it with the means of fighting, both in principle and language, were there. And I think that
And
that's an impressive part. I agree with you when I saw that personally, what you mentioned earlier. It is
sure.
something that has resonated with me as well.
But you make such a powerful point, especially for the abortion debate, with bringing up Frederick Douglass, because when I look at pro-life advocates, when what I describe as human rights advocates,
Hmm.
I think the most effective ones are those who do not get caught in the trap of debating evil. The moment you debate evil, I
Yeah.
think to some extent you invite the possibility of a utilitarian analysis
Yeah.
where, well, what really is evil for a society, and they can concoct very weak and facile arguments, but they can still concoct certain arguments where they can convince themselves that actually the lesser evil is to promote abortion access, for instance, especially once they invoke climate change. And let's just say, once you get into the debate about evil, it's very easy for people to fight dirty and to knock us off what the real point is, which the real point is the constitutional aspect. So just as slavery was objectively wrong from a constitutional perspective, I think the most effective pro-life advocates are those who focus on the constitutional aspects of the abortion debate. because based on my research and the research of, very accomplished attorneys and judges and justices, at the end of the day, it just cannot stand as it currently does. Speaking of Roe v. Wade, I mean, it's just not even a question.
Now, I completely took us off track. Let's get
Oh,
back
that's
on
okay.
track. So this is it, that moment in ethics where you start to see
Yeah.
this progression of justice,
Yeah.
grounded in these first principles of the United States, and then you see it fall short as is extended to the unborn.
Right.
And then, so this is what drives you towards your next step. Would that be correct?
That's correct. And it was still excellent foreshadowing. It was a nice appetizer for those later on in our discussion. So when I started at the University of Chicago, within my first year, I took a class on the qualitative methods of social sciences. This was a survey level course where we were supposed to basically propose a research plan. This is something that we could use for our master's or for our PhD. I was getting my PhD at the time, and I wanted to do a paper on how one could study the abortion debate. I wanted to understand, why do the two sides disagree? Why is it so controversial? What are the legal aspects? Before I started my PhD program, I had considered going to law school, but the economy was collapsing. It was 2009. And needless to say, it's hard to turn down full scholarship with a guaranteed salary and health insurance for 5 years, and as it turned out, I ended up going to law school anyways. But in this class, I had a professor, really kind man. He's since passed on. Unfortunately, when I proposed this research to him, he said, no, it's way too controversial. You can't do it. And I said, well, I mean, it's just a course paper. Like, people write course papers about tons of stuff.
Yeah.
And this is something I'm legitimately considering as my research, while at the University of Chicago. And he said, no, it's too controversial. Just do it on something else.
Wait, now who would see this course paper? I mean, what audience would be exposed to controversy?
Only him.
And his audience of one said, this is too controversial for me. I can't be exposed to that. You said he's a good man. I'm not arguing. I don't want to.
No, right.
Mocking him. It's a weird thing to say. I am the only audience that will get this paper, and it's too controversial for me.
I mean, in all honesty, Jay, and I'm starting to have feelings just talking about this now because it is a little emotional. 5 years of my life were basically taken away by his decision.
Wow.
So this put me on a path of trying to find, colleagues and other professors who would, give me strength where he had so weakened me. And, you talk about a shaming, I'm here in this very liberal institution with very specific concepts being thrown around, almost like a moral monoculture where everybody is kind of speaking the same language, right? Yep. And I'm coming there from a very different climate, not only ideologically, but even I'm under what they like to call the stereotype threat of I'm coming from a community college, from a state school, and here I'm coming to this wonderful institution, and I'm
one of the most elite institutions in the world.
And what an opportunity it was. But I mean, let's just say I didn't have the backbone required to go against a very famous professor and a very famous researcher who told me, you can't even do it for a paper. Like, are you crazy? You think you're going to do this for a master's or a dissertation? I won't even let you do it as a course paper. Wow. So I tried to find strength by, talking to peers, and I tried to see if anybody else would support me, even in having conversations about my research interests. And to a person, everybody shut me down and said I shouldn't be doing it. Some brought in my race, my faith. They brought in the fact that I was a man. I mean, it was just every excuse possible, because I think at the end of the day, they didn't assume that I had the right perspective on the abortion debate. So therefore, they didn't want me to use, let's say, the skills or the methods that I would learn at the University of Chicago in a way that could potentially harm their ideological aims. So if I was there and saying, I want to study abortion to justify it as abortion rights, everybody would have supported me. And if anything, I would have probably been one of the model students. but by even saying that I want to understand how to resolve the debate between the two sides, I think that instantly helped them understand that I wouldn't be, on one side of the debate trying to overpower the pro-lifers
Yeah, you're
with
not.
the institutional prestige.
That's right. You're not starting from the platform necessary for us to give you
Yeah.
support, right? We need to see that you have started your ships headed in the right direction
Yeah.
before we even let you leave this port. And we look like you look, even if like that language may be neutral, neutral's not good enough for us. It has
Well,
to.
neutral isn't neutral, right?
Yeah.
Anything to the right of the hype, and that's what we've seen over the last 4 years. Anything to the right of the hyper left is hyper right as far as they're concerned.
And then especially on this issue, and
Oh,
especially we
yeah.
talk about this, they are, and it has changed somewhat since I started talking about this publicly over a decade ago now.
Mm,
And there has been a transformation there where I think when I first started, I felt like there was a sense that the other side they thought of us as gadflies, right? They didn't really worry too much about engaging. And it
yeah.
wasn't until they lost a lot of real estate, both philosophically and legally,
Oh,
that
sure.
they seemed to wake up to the idea that this argument for the value of human life had traction, and
Yeah.
it was compelling to people, and
Hmm.
it was undercutting what they believed, something that couldn't be undercut, something they
Right.
believed that was placed on firm ground. And
Hmm.
there we're getting more of the protection of it. I think even in the last 10 years you've seen the rise of that idea of where at one point you were allowed to be a sort of a gadfly, like I said, a weirdo, somebody who's just
Yeah.
out there that's fighting for
But now
fighting.
you're a threat,
Now you're a threat. Yeah,
you know?
things have changed. The lay of the
Yeah.
land has changed, and so we have to protect our interests. So from there, okay, so now you have been shut down. You're looking for support. Where did you find? I mean, because obviously, as I said, the story ends with me saying your name almost every time I talk about abortion for the last year.
Oh,
So what we have to do is how do we persevere at this point, right?
right. So basically for the next 4 to 5 years, it was just private anguish with me wanting to do this research, me doing my research privately, not having the support of anybody at the school. At the same time, I had to do research on what I had done in undergrad, which was on gesture. So I actually used to research hand movements.
Oh
I
my
mean,
gosh. Now I feel completely judged because I am like a
no,
hand movement machine, man.
it's a signal of intelligence, so that's a
Oh,
good thing.
sweet. Thank you.
But yeah, so
I'm
I
gonna be
mean,
like
here,
Ricky Bobby the rest of the thing. What do I do
I
with
don't know what to do
my
with
I
my
don't know what to
hands.
do with my hands.
Yeah, and I mean that was what was so funny about it was I even sarcastically got the license plate gesture. I literally got gesture as a personalized license plate because I was so suffering at the notion that I was wasting my time and wasting my life on
Oh,
this. And here I was wanting to, you know, as I saw it, tackle what was the most divisive political issue, the thing that was harming American politics, and something that I saw as it was not coming from like a pro-life perspective. It was that this should be able to be mediated.
yeah,
There should be some kind of resolution. I mean, if we were able to figure out a solution to slavery, which we ended up going to a civil war over,
yeah,
how is abortion this intractable discussion that we can't figure out what makes sense for our country, especially when so many countries around the world don't have the debate that we have?
yeah,
So I saw it as I'm trying to help America. This wasn't about me, proving my intelligence. It wasn't about publications. It was just, I mean, I was a young man, and I felt like I had some insights and a work ethic, and I just wanted to apply it to a great need our society had. So it took a matter of years, but eventually I started kind of building up that confidence, and I decided if I applied to go to law school, that this would show my seriousness, that this was not just some project. This was something that I was willing to dedicate my career to. I was willing to go above and beyond compared to my other, fellow PhD students. Nobody in my department was getting a secondary doctorate, to show that, especially if I could get into a good institution, to show that how dedicated I was. So there was this one professor who I had TA'd for. I was his teaching assistant in a cultural psychology class. And he is very famous for tackling what are called sacred cows,
Mm.
issues that shouldn't be tackled, right? So some of his main research is on female genital modification. So in this class I TA'd, he spent a lot of time helping us understand FGM in the context of male circumcision, and he made a very sympathetic case for that cultural practice.
Oh,
So
wait,
I
now
felt,
let's take a second and make sure
oh,
that
sure.
people know what you're talking about there,
Yeah.
because it might
Uh,
not be as clear to everyone out there what you're talking about. So,
Right. So in certain cultures, they do the practice of, it's called all different things: female genital circumcision, modification, mutilation. Basically, and there's various types of procedures, but essentially, a physical manipulation is made to a woman's clitoris, and this is a cultural practice as a coming of age experience to move a woman from childhood into adulthood.
so this is the kind of thing this guy was willing to engage. He made it.
Oh,
Now, was this just a personality thing where he was just driven to allow everything out there for the sake of being discussed? I mean, was it just his
yeah.
nature?
So he is what's called a robust cultural pluralist. So he doesn't he creates the distinction between moral relativism and cultural pluralism. So moral relativism suggests that there is no wrong, that it's all based on what your culture thinks is right. So if the Vikings had a death culture that believed in conquering and raping and pillaging, that was right for them. But if we have hypersensitivities to political correctness, that's right for us. So that's relativism. Everything is relative to your culture. His is pluralism, by which he believes that one culture should be able to have various cultural practices, and we should be able to kind of live together in harmony, respecting and understanding that everybody has different cultures.
And but he had no like hard line there. I mean, I guess I've never,
Oh, sure.
I have never heard. I guess this is why I'm asking these questions.
Oh,
And let's only talk about this for a very brief moment. I
sure.
want to get on to more important things.
Right.
I have never in my life heard somebody at that level defending female genital mutilation in any way under the veil of cultural pluralism. I mean,
Right.
everybody I've ever, and that's why I think Sam Harris, as an atheist, has
Yeah.
locked in on this as well. Because look, it's clear that objective moral values exist because that's wrong and ought to be clear to every human being.
Well, and that's part of the reason why he was such an attractive option that I wanted to work with him. I mean, first off, he is fiercely intelligent. He, is seen as the father of cultural psychology by many. He
Wow.
was Jonathan Haidt's postdoctoral advisor, and Jonathan Haidt is one of the most famous psychologists today.
Yeah.
He had the book, Righteous Mind. So he actually attacks, my professor Rick Schwader. He attacked human rights advocates, the World Health Organization, for their, demonization of the practice. But basically, as it fits in my story, the point is he's willing to attack
Yes.
those sacred cows. He is fearless.
He clearly is fearless. I would agree.
So my thought was, who better, and I still remember the day. I mean, I happen to have somewhat of a episodic memory where I could kind of see where I was at that moment. I still hear sounds of an experience, right? So I remember when that first professor turned me down and told me that it was too controversial, just like I remember the first time I sat in Rick Schwader's office and told him I wanted to go to law school and I wanted to do research on the controversy of the abortion debate. And when he told me that he would take me on as a student, I mean, I have goosebumps describing it now. You have to understand, 5 years of my life in fear and feeling like I was wasting my time and
Wow.
wasting this opportunity. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm welling up a little bit. Like it meant so much to me. And sure enough, even in that discussion, I told him, he asked me, he kind of wanted to know, like, what is your perspective on the abortion debate? Do you have a bias? Like he already assumed I was pro-life based on the way I was talking about it. But I said, the only thing I'm willing to stand on, Rick, and this is what I truly believed at that moment, and I still believe it, is that fetuses are objectively biological humans. By virtue of them being humans, they are deserving of rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights conventions, because it's made clear that all members of the human family are deserving of those rights. I told him I can't necessarily say abortion is a human rights violation, even though I believed it to be. But I basically said that is the stone on which I'm operating from.
Okay.
So he knew that, and he said, "Well, who says human rights are right?" Because he attacked them in his research. So I said, "Well, I can't say that it's right. What I can say is we agree that that's the playing field on which we play. So if that's what we're going to use to dictate whether something's right or wrong," I said, technically, if we're actually following our first principles, abortion is presumably a human rights violation, which it's very complicated to actually get to that final step. But basically, that's what he understood. So it's not like I duped him into thinking I was a pro-choice person and I wanted to do this research. Like, he knew where I was coming from, and he fully supported it. And I went off to law school. I went to Northwestern Law. They had an accelerated JD program where I did 3 years of law school in 2 years. So I actually did May of 2014 to May of 2016. And then I got right to work with Rick. So I did 2 years of law school, and then I jumped right into my research with Rick. Very excited.
Yeah. Now you're making me feel bad about all the choices I've made in life, right? While I was pursuing my PhD, I just got a law degree from Northwestern Law School. Why not? Sure, go ahead. Just color it up a little bit for the rest of us, right?
No, it was out of necessity. I mean, it's fun.
No.
And it's funny. It was the first day of law school. We went around the room, first day of law school, like I'm talking about preschool, but we went around the room and they asked everybody why Northwestern Law. And I was able to say that I actually had a letter from myself in 8th grade that said I was going to go to Northwestern Law, I was going to become an attorney, and I was going to drive a Mercedes and be rich. Obviously, I gave up on all of that, but I still stayed committed to.
In 8th grade, right?
I don't know why I thought that. Nobody in my family was educated, but I guess.
It's good for you. You had a vision for yourself, man. I think I still wanted to be like Indiana Jones in 8th grade, right? I still thought archaeologist was like, fighting in the jungles against the Nazis or something stupid like that.
And he was a professor at University of Chicago, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's all coming together.
It's all
coming together. Okay. So now let's go through, now that we have background, and I love it, by the way, I really appreciate that. Let's dive in to the PhD research. Now here's what I love about, and why I keep saying I quote you all the time. I use your name a lot. I reference your research. Here's what I love about PhD research. For those people who don't fully understand what a PhD project is like, what the pursuit of that is, it is, and if I make any mistakes, feel free to clarify it for the audience. It is your job to try to find a novel area of research, some area where there has not been a tremendous focus on a very specific idea. And then you essentially are becoming, for lack of a better term, and to be as most clear, I think, with the audience, the world's expert on this particular subject matter. This is not a generalist who reads a couple of books and comes up with some ideas. This is not even a master's level of research. This is the deepest of deep dives into one particular question and doing everything that you can to settle this issue, at least so much as the question that you're bringing to it. And so that's what's so powerful about what you have done with this PhD research, is that we're not just talking about some guy who I know from another organization that did some background research and is sending me. This was the deepest of dives towards a PhD at one of the most prestigious universities on planet Earth. And this is the kind of information that we can look at now and say, whatever comes out of this on the other side, as the part of the story now is where we're entering into the PhD research, whatever comes out of the other side, it will be vetted like you can't possibly imagine.
Yeah. And I mean, that's it shows some people with PhDs because you couldn't have described it better. So I've often heard it described as it confers expertise or it validates you as an expert. Now, this is not to say you're an expert on everything.
On this
It's
one
not very
thing. Yeah.
generalizable. And I would probably estimate anywhere between 80 to 95% of people, what they learn in that project, they don't even use in their career. The only people who do are professors. And as we're seeing now, most people who get PhDs don't become professors. I didn't become a professor. And,
Yeah.
let's just say academia isn't too amenable to having a person like me as a professor. But it is true that you're doing, like you said, the deepest of dives. I mean, as it turned out, my dissertation is 320 pages with over 1,000 footnotes. I spent 2 years in law school, and then I spent 3 years, long hours doing nothing but obsessing about this research.
Yeah.
And, in terms of the vetting, I had a committee of four professors who all were admittedly pro-choice. And some of them actually had strong bona fides in the pro-choice movement.
Yeah.
So one was married to somebody who's a really well-known name in the pro-choice side. One of my a law professor who was on my committee, he said he had done work for NARAL, the National Association for Reform of Abortion Laws. I mean, these were not faint-hearted abortion rights supporters. These people were hardcore, and they definitely drilled me, and they made sure that I did everything in such a way that they felt I was a serious, legitimate researcher. Because trust me, they would have denied me my degree if they could have. And now I can actually get into the substantial pressure I faced, if you'd like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's talk through that, because that was the first thing I wanted people to understand, because there's a reason why the second you published, I switched the way I talk about certain things, because it's different for me to get up and to talk about a consensus of opinion based on my having gathered information as we're talking about human life beginning at fertilization. I for years, I mean, for the better part of a decade, when I talked about this, I would get up and I had strong evidence that I carried with me at all times. And I would encourage the audience to come check out that I could give them evidence and citations, but it was me saying that it has been my experience that there is a consensus from both sides on when human life begins. And that's not really the core that we're arguing about for the most part when we're out there. But what you did was you put it through an academic process with rigor and structure and vetting, and vetting, as you pointed out, from people that aren't exactly in support of what it is that the information that's coming out of your research. And for that group to confer upon you, as the language you use, expertise in this area, you did your due diligence. And so I'm a guy, what I like is what we call competitive competence, right? I cherish ideas that have just been argued and fought and published over. And if they have survived that sort of thunderdome of where competitive ideas go to die, and they come out alive, then I have a great deal of confidence when I'm standing in front of an audience saying that. And when I saw your research come out, I was like, I now have something that I can have a high level of confidence talking about when the discussion of what the consensus is about when human life begins. So that's what I wanted, as we jump into this to more detail about the process you went through. I just wanted to make sure everybody understood. This is not just study. This is the most study that anybody ever does on a particular. When people get their PhDs, they study a specific area more than anybody studies anything. Now, everybody that goes through this process does that for their area, but this is, as we said, the deepest of deep dives on the questions that you're asking.
Indeed. And you'll probably love this. So when I was at Northwestern Law, I was taking a class on public persuasion and advocacy, and we had to deliver speeches, write speeches for each other. And at one point, I gave my first speech on the abortion rights issue, right?
Yeah.
And at one point, I just invoked the notion that there's a scientific consensus on when life begins, because that was the language that most people used at the time. And the consensus was a loose consensus based on the fact that, there had been Senate testimony in 1981, and, there's all the South Dakota Abortion Task Force. They had asked experts, so it was very loose. But my professor, he gave me back my speech, and next to where I said that there was a consensus on when life begins, he wrote source question mark.
Yeah.
And at that moment, I was like, "Oh, you want a source? Okay, we'll get a source." So,
Yeah, we'll make one, right?
I mean, but that's what the job of a researcher is, right?
Yes.
So if I was just an advocate, I would have to go and find that. But as a researcher, it was something I could actually operationalize and add to the literature. So when I started working with Rick, this was in the summer of 2016, literally right after graduating law school. Let's just say there were some opportunities to make a little money in corporate law,
Yeah.
but I was fully dedicated to my cause, and that's why I actually didn't sit for the bar exam.
Hmm.
So I felt there'd be too much of a temptation to jump into the practice of law. So I didn't sit for the bar exam because I didn't go to law school to become an attorney. I
Yeah.
went to get a legal education to help my research. So in that opening summer, I actually started by going to biology classes and talking to PhDs in genetics and biology and getting a sense of how would I operationalize this question? How would I survey people on when life begins? I also started by surveying Americans, and I had surveyed about 100 Americans on who they thought was most qualified to determine when a human's life begins.
Yeah.
Because that's the whole thing. I mean, if I just say, scientists' perspective on when life begins is most relevant, who am I to say that? On what basis? People
Yeah.
could say, no, I think it's a philosophical question, right?
That's what I loved about your research when I read it, was it was clear that you have been very careful not to proceed with any assumptions.
No,
You
yeah,
started out from the beginning. We will make no assumptions, right? Even to the point where you did research on why people hold a pro-life or a pro-choice position. What is the central issue to them?
yeah,
And then now you're talking about the process of saying, if we're going to try to answer this question, what is the reliable source that you want that answer to come from? There's
yeah.
an intentional discipline not to assume anything in how you structured your research. And I loved that when I was reading it.
Oh, great. I appreciate that. And that bore out of conversations, with professors who weren't, necessarily amenable to supporting the pro-life movement.
Yeah.
And they just grilled me, and I worked with them to understand, how do we lay out this case so it really is, to some extent above reproach.
Yeah.
And what I did was I started by using the experts considered by the Roe court. So in Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court made the landmark abortion decision, and they said that at that time, there was no consensus on when life begins, and they considered possible experts who'd opine on when life begins. And they mentioned doctors, biologists, theologians, philosophers. So I presented them, my participants, with biologists, philosophers, religious leaders, Supreme Court justices, and voters. I wanted to see,
Straight out of Roe v. Wade.
yeah, is it a
Yeah.
democratic issue that we
Yeah.
should agree upon? Is it philosophical, religious, or is it just scientific? And, they said that they weren't in a position. The justices said they were in no position to determine it. So I asked people, do you think Supreme Court justices are? And as it turned out, the initial sample was about 86% affirmed that biologists were most qualified. As it turned out, when I ended up with 4,000 participants, it was about 80% said biologists. And interestingly, pro-choice people were more likely to select biologists, because pro-life people, many of them selected religious leaders.
Yeah.
So as it turns out, it's a mutually agreed upon expert. And this actually came out of my experiences in law school. While in law school, I became a mediator. So maybe I buried the lead on that. But so I had won a negotiation competition. I had competed in Texas for this national negotiation competition. And my school had a mediation program. So that was kind of my angle into my research, is as I started, back in 2010, suggesting I want to heal the debate. I thought, well, what better approach than that of a mediator?
That,
So I
that
be
makes perfect sense, having read your and getting beyond my desire to just roll my eyes again at this ongoing story of excellence. But did you just why don't I just add this
oh,
successful thing to what I'm doing already as well? No, but seriously, that comes through, and then you say that it makes perfect sense of some of the language that I was reading. I remember the first time reading it, it sounded like a mediator. It was
mm,
writing. I mean, there was certain language that was there that makes sense for that's a part of the tool box that you're bringing. That's one of the tools in the kit that
absolutely.
you're bringing to all of this. So I didn't mean to interrupt. Please
Oh
go on.
no, no, that was so. I appreciate that. I mean, that mediating perspective. I mean, and not to get too ahead of myself, but I have a law review article coming out in Tennessee Law Review this summer, and ultimately, I don't even say what the resolution should be. I'm big into to keeping to that mediator's perspective, where I truly am just trying to help both sides understand each other better and figure out a way how there can be compromise.
And that's
So
that's
I
hard, I
appreciate
think,
that.
for some people. I think it's
Oh,
hard, especially because if you take for me, I've always taken the position that if I encourage you towards higher level of information, if what I represent is corresponds to the truth, right? The correspondence
sure.
theory of truth. If the things that I'm expressing better correspond to the actual objective truth of reality, then opening the path of exploration, encouraging
Hmm.
a deeper knowledge on any particular subject will naturally lead them towards my position. And so now
Right.
I am less, now obviously I'm not writing a PhD. I make no
Yeah.
expression or claim to objectivity on this, not objectivity, but to be impartial, right? I am partial.
Sure.
But I
Yeah.
landed on the position that I hold through being once pro-choice and gravitating towards a different view of human beings and ultimately a different understanding of a different ethical approach to the idea of abortion. And I
Hmm.
understand, I think, the people that I'm trying to reach. And so I value what you're saying there, in that sense that at this level of argument and expression at the academic level, it's not
Hmm.
necessary for you to brandish your partisanship as much as
Right.
it for you to try to draw people into a deeper knowledge. And if
Yeah.
the position that we've already talked about is true, then that
Hmm.
exploration and that pursuit of knowledge will lead them closer to that truth and ultimately to our side.
Yeah, I mean, you could lead a horse to water. You could even give it a salt cube, but don't throw head into the water.
Yeah.
And I mean, I do have that deep ambivalence about telling anybody how they should come out on really any policy. And I think that's part of the reasons why I was attracted to this approach and why I as a mediator, and I really enjoyed that. It's because I just have this perspective that it's like I'm not the kind of person who wants to, intervene on somebody and force them into a particular way because, given my training as a psychologist, I understand that people don't respond to that first off. That people best respond when they're actually able to make that final leap themselves. You can walk with them hand to hand, but at that final moment, it has to be volitional on their perspective. Otherwise, the moment something goes wrong, they're going to blame you for having causing them to take that stance. So,
Yeah, that's why
you
I
know,
tell people all the time. And one of the things, like the core, is I say that we're not trying to win arguments. I'm not trying to beat people down with my arguments. I'm actually
amen.
trying to win people with good arguments.
Right.
Out of the idea that the more people that are on our side, the more that we build the force necessary to change culture to one that protects life. Now, we can get
Yeah.
into other discussions at
Oh,
a
sure.
different point about at what point, as Leon Cass says, the law must step in for those who remain unconvinced.
Oh, sure.
But let's table that and let's move on
Yeah.
to something. Maybe I'll get you to come back and we can talk about
Oh,
that
okay.
some other time.
Yeah. So when I started with this research, I basically got this mandate that biologists were most qualified. I had surveyed Americans and I asked them, is it an important question in the abortion debate? The question of when life begins? They said it was. They said that Americans deserve to know when life begins, to
Yeah.
be informed in their positions on abortion, as well as in their reproductive decisions, which suggests that, how can one have informed consent if they actually do not view that fetus as a human, if it's a human, right? Would you make the same decision if you were misled into believing it's no different than a skin cell,
Yeah.
or if you understood it to be a human, right? So I basically got this mandate, how I saw it, that as a mediator, your job is to resolve factual disputes. It's very hard to resolve opinion disputes.
Yeah.
So, in this discussion, I can't tell you how to value human life, but we can understand whether or not it is a human life, whether or not it is a human. So what I did was I started surveying biologists. I actually went online and I went to probably around 2,000 websites for colleges and universities around the world. I spent over 500 hours just myself. People said,
Wait, you said 2,000 websites to give you access to by far far greater number of colleges and universities around the world, right? I just wanted to clarify that. The
yeah,
number 2,000 wasn't the number of universities. That was the number of websites that you visited.
yeah. So
Okay.
this
Yeah.
this
All
was
right.
I had to translate
Sounds like
Chinese
fun.
websites into English, Russian websites into English, because it wasn't enough to just do American biologists, because obviously one could argue that Americans have a pro-life
Yeah.
bias, or at least that because it's controversial, they might be more inclined to affirm it. So I wanted to understand around the world, do biologists see a human zygote as a human? Do
As,
they
as
believe
much as possible, get the cultural bias out of there.
exactly,
Yeah.
or
Right.
even understand the cultural
Yeah.
bias? So
Yeah.
maybe
Okay.
one culture doesn't recognize that and another does.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
So I ended up collecting tens of thousands of biologists contact information, and I started my survey. So this was a survey. It went through many different variations. This was working with biologists, geneticists, to figure out how do I actually ask this in the most objective scientific measure possible,
Mhm.
because I don't want it to be in a moral register. I wouldn't ask a biologist, isn't it true that abortion is murder? Like,
Yeah.
isn't it
Yeah.
true that abortion kills a human? Like, that's so loaded, and you're invoking their political perspectives, their philosophical perspectives. So for me, it was important to just focus on the biology. From a biological perspective, when does a human's life begin?
Yeah.
Does mammalian development start at fertilization? So I posed them 5 different operative items, and then I even asked them an essay question, because I wanted to make sure I wasn't just pigeonholing them into one perspective. I wanted them to speak freely about how they view the beginning of humans' life. And unfortunately, this study that I'm describing was stopped 5 different times
Wow.
over the course of a couple years. And it involved me having to meet with my school's legal department, the research administration. There were countless complaints from biologists, from other people who learned of my study, because I wasn't flying under the radar, having conversations with biologists. I sent out tens of thousands of emails in a moment around the world.
Yeah.
So everybody became clued in on, whoa, what's going on here, right? Why is this guy doing this survey? And I had people threaten me, saying that I'm gonna notify my colleagues to not answer your survey because you're a pro-life plant and you're just a Christian, you're a zygote worshiper. I mean, the kinds of things people said to me, you seem like a Ku Klux Klan member, or it seems like Trump designed this survey. I mean, just
Okay. Wait.
and they're all PhDs.
I want to be clear, and you
Yeah,
need to, and I'll get our
sure.
guys to make sure there's a link to your stuff on our where when we post this on YouTube.
Yeah,
The questions you're asking, they could not be less what they just described. I mean, it's basically, essentially, I can't remember the exact wording, but in some of them, it's like
yeah,
a mammal's life begins at fertilization. I mean, it's like, yeah, that's like crazy fascist there, right? To ask a biologist
right.
to answer the question of when does a a new distinct individual organism come
Yeah,
into existence. You just ask biologists to speak in their area of expertise, and this was the response you get, that you had to meet with legal teams because you said, "Hey, biologist, when does an organism begin to exist in the mammal family?" Oh, well, oh my gosh, you're a monster.
and and in the context of science, I mean, this has been undisputed since the early 1830s, when a German biologist understood that all mammalian life begins as a zygote.
Yeah.
This is something. It's actually the reason why we had restrictive abortion laws in the United States from the 1860s to the 1960s. Most people don't know this, but abortion was banned throughout the country in every state except for life of the mother exceptions. That was the only circumstance in which
Yep.
one could have a legal abortion. And this was because the American Medical Association, they propagated the view that it's a human. So since it's a human's life, under typical homicide statutes, abortion should be treated as the killing of a human. So I mean, this scientific perspective, I understand that it's been lost in recent decades because it isn't politically convenient for
Yeah.
some people. But I mean, it's
And
fairly. I mean, I
you
had
didn't
some
ask them
biology.
to speak to the right or wrong of it. You
No,
didn't
no,
ask them to
no,
weigh in. You didn't ask them any
no.
philosophical question. You directly asked them for information that was relevant to their
Yeah.
field. And that is, as you just said, is probably the easiest question they're going to be asked all day.
And some actually suggested that this was beneath them, that I wasted their time on something that is so simple, so elementary. But it's like, in a time in which people don't know this,
Yeah.
about 45% of the country understands that it's a human at fertilization. They believe, when presented with these items in polls, public polling, it's something like less than half recognize it as a scientific or biological fact, and instead they see it as a philosophical or religious belief.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you talk about a gap in science understanding, I mean, this is also some of the first research that showed that conservatives and pro-lifers are far closer to scientists on a scientific view than liberals and Democrats.
Okay, so they
Yeah.
5 times it stopped. Five
Yeah.
times you have to meet with the legal department of Northwestern University. I'm not of Chicago, University of Chicago.
Yeah.
So let's go from there.
Right. So unfortunately, the first few times it stopped, my professor, Rick Schwader, he actually supported me. He was my fiercest advocate in that
Yeah.
legal hearing, or that university hearing with the legal department. And as time moved on, though, there was a bit of a time when I wasn't doing the research. So basically, I was writing up my dissertation proposal for about a year while he wanted things to die down. It was such an intense response. I mean, people talked about the ethics committee at my school, that they had never seen something like this before. This kind of backlash that they were undergoing. So he told me, let things die down, give it some time, write up your proposal, and then you could continue your research. So sure enough, I wrote up my proposal. I defended it successfully. It was made clear that I was going to continue my research on When Life Begins, because this was a factual dispute that needed to be resolved in order to progress the mediations. Because how could I sit down in a discussion with pro-life and pro-choice people if they are hamstrung by a disagreement on When Life Begins?
Yeah.
And sure enough, in law school, I did these mediations with one pro-life and one pro-choice person, and I would ask them, I would go through debate with them, and they couldn't come to a common understanding of whether or not it's a human. And that drastically changes the debate, because if it's not a human, pro-life people are just trying to control women and just trying to force them into having kids, as many like to put it. But if it's a human, then pro-lifers have to be respected as human rights advocates who are trying to protect life.
Yeah,
So
this
it's
is
not
one of the things that I say when
yeah.
I say, and I mean, but
Sure.
the way that I say that when I talk to audiences, when I'm encouraging them, the same thing. This is an argument we have to have,
Yeah.
because the moral cost for being wrong on either side is too high to not engage this issue.
So
We're required to deal with this, because whoever is right and whoever is wrong, the cost of being wrong is so high either way. As you said, if I'm wrong in the positions that I advocate, then I am unnecessarily trying to involve the government in the medical decisions that women are making that have nothing to do with me or ethics or value of life. It's just tissue being removed.
Sure.
And if they're wrong and I'm right, then it's the intentional destruction of innocent human life on an incomprehensible scale. But
Oh,
either way, whichever one of those is right and whichever one is wrong, the moral cost is so high either way, we're
mhm.
obligated to engage this issue.
Absolutely. And I felt like I was that was endorsed even by the pro-choice people themselves.
Yeah.
Now they actually anticipated that there would be a consensus, and they thought that the consensus would support the pro-choice side. Interestingly enough, when I asked pro-choice Americans when they believe a human's life begins from a biological perspective, less than a quarter said fertilization. The large majority said viability or birth. So they've actually internalized what I see as the Supreme Court decision in Roe. You know, while the Supreme Court wasn't saying
Yeah.
viability is when a human's life begins, it's very easy for people not to obsessively research old abortion cases and to instead take it as if abortion can be legal before viability, then it must not be a human before viability.
Yeah.
And that's what I found. Most said that a human's life begins at viability. And that's just because that was coming, you know, from on high, from the Supreme Court, and it made its way downstream to pro-choice people.
But that's got to be slight. I mean, I know for those of us who argue in this, there could be the reaction to hearing that with cynicism, right? But if we
Mhm.
if we try our best to give other people the benefit of the doubt and to give them the most generous interpretation of their views
Sure.
possible, I think that has to be somewhat encouraging to understand they genuinely don't believe it's a human life.
Oh,
And that's why they advocate for the things that they do in many cases. Now, we do see when we talk about bodily autonomy arguments, a different category of argument that's happening. And then
yeah,
there is also some people that just are insensitive to the conversation altogether, and
sure.
they're unreflective. They refuse to reflect on it all. They bring their prejudices to their argument, and they will have no further discussion. But as you said a second ago, even the pro-choice people that you talked to agreed that this needed resolution. And
Yep.
they wanted to see this research proceed at that level. And as I say, if we give them the most generous interpretation possible of their views, there is something encouraging about the idea that so many of them genuinely believe it's not a human life, because that means
Mhm.
that with at least with some section of the people that disagree with us, we have hope of convincing them that their view is wrong, as opposed to the other one, which I could see if we're cynical and jaded and
Mhm.
give people the least generous, then what's the point of trying to convince them, because they can't be convinced.
Absolutely. And in the same conversation, the same thread on Twitter, when I discuss these issues, I'll have one person say, everyone knows it's a human. Like everybody knows that, right? And then the next person will be another pro choicer who says they're not humans. So it's like,
Yeah,
how is it that at the same time, everyone
and
recognizes
invoking
it?
science, right?
Right. And
Yeah,
sure
it's
enough,
yeah,
my advisor, so he said when I had my initial results that showed that the great majority said that it's not a human at fertilization of pro-choicers, he said that's because you just used human. You didn't restrain it to the biology. If you constrained it to biology, they would say, of course it's a biological human. I basically got laughed at a meeting with several students, several PhDs and postdocs, when I suggested that most pro-choicers did not recognize a fetus as a biological human, and I had people using anecdotal evidence who would say, well, all of my friends admit it. And I'm like, I have thousands of American respondents who say that it's not a human until viability. And you're just discarding my data in favor of what are your assumptions. And, you know, getting back to you can have assumptions. I mean, I asked probably, I think it was over 300 variations of questions to Americans. I mean, I did countless surveys with
wow.
thousands of Americans. And I mean, you talk about a deep dive. I wanted to understand what is there, you know, I wanted to know, are they, you know, is there differences between pro-life and pro-choice people in terms of feminism, in terms of support of women's rights, in terms of the support for the right to life in general terms, or the support for the right to autonomy in general terms? Because it might be like in vaccines that there's a big difference by which, you know, pro-lifers believe that there is a right to bodily autonomy and a decision not to become vaccinated, and then pro-choicers have a difference of opinion. But as I found, none of those were different. There were
Yeah.
no differences between pro-life and pro-choice people other than their ideology, whether they were conservative or liberal, and then when life begins. That was actually the biggest predictor. And I should have a piece coming out relatively soon. I've submitted it for publication that describes these models that I did. So
Okay.
modeling is a statistical technique by which you look at several different predictors and see which one is the strongest predictor of whatever your variable is. So let's say if we were doing people's weight, the strongest predictor would be how many calories they consumed each day, right? Or or what their caloric difference was between how much they eat and how much they exercise. So what I found was when life begins is the number one predictor of whether or not somebody is pro-life or pro-choice. So while many will say, well, all Christians are pro-life and atheists are pro-choice, I found if you're an atheist who believes it's a human at fertilization, you're likely to be pro-life.
Yeah.
And if you're a Christian who believes it begins at birth, you're actually likely to be pro-choice. And sure enough, my sample of biologists, just to make sure to get this in, it was 85% pro-choice. It was 92% Democrat. It was predominantly liberal. I mean, it's not as if I was just asking pro-life people.
And
even my American sample was predominantly pro-choice.
That's the ones that responded of the responses that you got.
That's correct.
Right? And that was over 5,500. What was the exact number, right, of respondents?
So in my working paper is 5502. So 5,000. Yeah. So, I mean, there's all different ways of like cutting the data, but basically it was, thousands of biologists and the large majority. And this is something that has been found in psychology, in all these different disciplines, that by and large, they are predominantly liberal, Democrat, pro-choice.
And you said 80%, right? I mean, we're talking about like
85%.
85% of those respondents
yeah,
identified themselves as liberal, pro-choice on that
right.
side.
If my sample would have been 50% pro-life, it would have obviously been a skewed sample because we all know predominantly in academia, people are pro-choice. So
that's good because if we think of them like, obviously anytime you're doing that kind of research, you wonder, people worry about the self-selective nature of the people who respond.
Exactly.
Right? And so that gives us even more, as you said, more support for the idea that this response was representative of academic biologists and not a self-selected group that responded that skewed the data one way or another.
Right. And while I did find some differences between pro-life and pro-choice people on certain items, obviously those who were most pro-choice were least likely to affirm these items, to affirm that a human's life begins at fertilization, and very pro-life people were more likely. They were all still overwhelmingly likely. And what that means is I think I ended up having something like 40 different variables in terms of how many kids do you have, how, what is your educational status, where are you on the pro-life to pro-choice spectrum, liberal, conservative. And I found that in every single subcategory, among atheists, among, agnostic people, every single one had a consensus that life begins at fertilization. So it wasn't as if, people in Asia, professors in Asia were similarly likely to recognize it as a human at fertilization as people in Europe and North America. Because when you get so much data, I mean, you could cut it so many different ways. I mean, if you only have 100 people and then you end up with only 2 people from Africa that are men, but when you have 5,000, you can just study it any way you want. So, I found overwhelmingly that a human's life begins at fertilization. And like you said, once my research came out, that was kind of when everything exploded. And I mean, it's been a bit of a wild ride. It's, something like 10 months ago. And I'm still, getting my bearings. And, most people, when they finish their PhD, there's kind of like a lull because they had this like huge mission and now they've completed it. But with me, if anything, it just ramped up.
Well, I said, I mean, you changed at least a couple of minute section of every talk that I give, and the things that I publish. I have on our website a little PDF that we made, a 1-page PDF that I made at the request of a very large international organization that said,
"Oh, wonderful!
Can you give me a 1-page pro-life argument?" And I was like, at first, no way. And so what I did was, in the fashion of all overwork, right, of all the people that we do too much, I wrote
Yeah.
like a 70-page book, and then was able to dilute it down to one page.
Yeah.
But in that page, of all the things that made it through, your name makes it through, because that's how important what you did is. And when we get to the final resolution, right? It's 96% of the
Mhm.
more than 5,500 academic biologists, and I think, if I correct me if I'm wrong, 95% of them hold PhDs.
Yeah, I think that was right.
Yeah, that 95% of the
Mhm.
5,500 are PhD level academic
Oh, yeah.
biologists, and 96% of them affirmed on one of the categories that you were given, that life
Yeah.
begins at fertilization. A zygote is the first stage of development for a
Mhm.
whole distinct and new organism. Correct?
Right. And they did that on the basis of how do we classify organisms, right? Biologically, from that perspective, what is our approach? And it used to be morphological. It used to be based on your limbs, your appendages, basically what we can see on an organism. That's how early biologists classify things. Obviously, it'd be hard to classify a single cell as the same as a walking, talking human, right? But if you use the genetic approach, which is what is the dominant approach today in terms of
Yeah.
how we classify organisms, it's the simple question of, does it have human DNA? And that separates it from non-humans and non-human tissue. And is it developing in the human life cycle? And this is what distinguishes a human zygote from a skin cell,
Yeah.
or from a sperm, or an egg, because those things are haploid cells with only 23 chromosomes, and they're just not developing in the human life cycle. They're pre-humans, I guess, is one way you could describe them.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Well, they're
like I said,
parts.
right, they're human tissue. The
That's
best way of describing it is human tissue.
They are
You can't.
cells that serve the
Yeah,
reproduction of another organism. They're part of an organism, right? And even and
exactly.
that's the weirdest thing for people to try to understand. It's like, look, the sperm does leave the man's body, but it still is the man's. It is cells from the man, reproductive cells that are serving his organism
Yes,
by means of assuring reproduction. And so
right.
they're reproductive cells, parts of organisms. They're not organisms in and of themselves.
Exactly. And I mean, the Supreme Court actually took note of that at one point in a recent case. They said that both sides of this case did not dispute that a human zygote is an organism. Now, obviously, that's stopping well short of actually, adopting it as a human and recognizing that.
Yeah.
But while many push back against this, there's actually a great article that I think it's Derek Smith put together, and I could send you the link for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It describes the pro-choice people who are on record admitting that a human's life begins at fertilization. So this is the great philosophers like Judith Jarvis Thompson and Peter Singer. This is politicians, leaders of, Alan Guttmacher is listed, of the Guttmacher Institute, the famous research arm of Planned Parenthood, Margaret Sanger. I mean, all these important names in the abortion rights movement who've admitted that it's a human.
Yeah.
And I actually put together something for Illinois Right to Life that has dozens upon dozens of scientific articles, biology textbooks, scientific definitions that all affirm that a human's life begins at fertilization.
Wow.
So, I mean, based on the totality of the evidence, based on the consensus of biologists, based on all of the scientific sources, and the fact that there is no competing scientific view.
Yeah.
So if you talk to Dr. Maureen Kondik,
Yeah.
she's probably one of the most famous people in this area, and I've had great conversations with her. She was a tremendous source of support because she had faced so much backlash for so long in her career.
Mhm.
And she was able to, give me a bit of encouragement when I was in my darker times. And I mean, as she likes to put it, confirming that a human's life begins at fertilization, I'm paraphrasing her, is not the point at which the abortion debate ends, but the point at which it really begins.
Yeah.
And it's almost like, how can we figure out how to interpret facts and design policy if we don't at least know what those facts are? So as far as I'm concerned, the fact that there is no competing theory which you cannot find in any scientific
Yeah.
source, or at least I was not able to find something that seriously considers that you are not, that is not a human organism before viability, before any of the stages of development. So
Yeah,
given those
I love
facts,
Dr. Kondik, by the way.
oh,
And
she's
I
wonderful.
was actually at Northwestern with at the time it was Students for Life Illinois. Now We Dignify.
Yeah, wonderful organization. Yeah.
I was speaking at one of their events at Northwestern, and Dr. Kondik was speaking there as well. And I had the pleasure, and I mean the pleasure, of spending several hours just hanging out with
Oh,
her and
that's
talking to her.
wonderful.
And she is just a wonderful person. But she and her brother Samuel Kondik, in their book,
Yeah.
it was Human Embryos, Human Beings, isn't that the name of it? I've got it right behind me over here. If I'm forgetting the name of it, but I'll put that up to make sure that I didn't mess that up. But
Sure.
what she says in there, I think is so great, because she asked the question, what else could it be? And I think, and that's what you're saying. When
Yeah.
you said there's no competing view. The sperm cell ceases to exist. The
Yeah.
ovum ceases to exist. So we have a new cell, and we have the responsibility now to identify what it is. There is no competing view. It
Yeah.
is a whole distinct living human organism from the moment
Yeah.
it comes into existence. Now, and I like what she said, when she talks about the idea now's where the fight starts. What
Mhm.
we've done is, and I'll be doing there'll be a new PDF coming up on the website soon that talks about proper categories of arguing in the pro-life argument.
Oh, wonderful.
And to recognize that what you've done here, and why I value what you've done so much, is, and I said this recently in an online discussion with somebody who was struggling to agree with me, was that you have moved us past the science discussion as far as I'm concerned. Because when you say that 96% of academic biologists affirm, and the PhD research, we're talking about over 5,500, and none of them, as far as we can tell, with a deep political axe to grind in favor of the pro-life view. When 96% of them affirm that this is a human organism, a human life that's come into existence, now we move on to the philosophical question.
Yes.
Now we're allowed to leave that argument behind. As I told somebody recently, you are a part of an outlier group now. You are so marginalized within the consensus thought if you deny the humanity of the unborn. Now the question is, what are our moral obligations and duties to other human beings, and when did they begin?
Sure.
And that's not a science question. That's a different conversation that has to be had. And we have to make sure we're arguing in proper categories. But your research, and I want to release you so that you can go back to your life, because we've had a great conversation here.
I'm so enjoying myself.
But your
Thank you,
research,
Jay.
what it has done, why I'm so immensely grateful to it, is because it has effectively moved us off of that one part. We're able to now point to enough. We have arguments, and now instead of just as you and I talked about earlier, a loose understanding of a consensus gathered from our own experiences reading in this area, we have research, a deep committed research on this particular subject matter, where we found out who people wanted the answer from. Where I'm acting like I had something.
No.
Where you found out who they wanted the answer from, whether they thought the answer should be sought the answer from those people, did it in with no assumptions, in the most non-threatening language possible, and got the biologist to give us the answer that we all knew was the answer to begin with. That's why I love what you said. Those guys said, this is beneath me to have to answer this question.
Right.
Of course, it's a living human being. It's a human life. Of course, it's a human organism, because I know some people freak out about the word being. Of course, it's a human life.
Yeah, I don't use being. Yeah.
Because what else could it be? There's no competing theory here. This just is what it is. And so for that is why I just changed everything from the moment that your name came out in the public. And you and I actually met in Chicago briefly, because I was there. And the funny thing was, I was speaking the night before you came and spoke at this event. I was speaking at the university at Loyola, I believe, and doing Q&A afterwards. And I started to talk and quote your research, and I saw Kevin Grill in the back smiling. And as I was talking, I looked down and picked up my events sheet for what was going to be going on that weekend, and I was like, he's here, right? He's going to be talking about this tomorrow to an audience. So I was talking to a group of people that were about to meet you. So I did a great job at setting you up and pumping them up for how great it is.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, and it's not lost on me that to some extent my work was proving water is wet. This is not like a hyper challenging question. I would say it took a little nuance to figure out how to actually establish that consensus. I don't want to undersell the work, but I mean, this is not, it's almost unfortunate that it has fallen so out of favor for political reasons that whereas it was something that was known in the early 19th century and throughout much of the 20th century, that we've actually lost that understanding due to competing narratives that were literally designed to protect abortion access. I mean, at the end of the day, the denial of fetal humanity, I mean, it's artificially propped up abortion rights support. And I asked Americans, I asked them, if it became common knowledge that a human's life begins at fertilization, would this reduce abortion rates? 90% of pro-choice people said that it would.
Wow.
83% said support for legal abortion access would go down because their whole perspective is premised on the notion that it's not a human liability.
Yeah.
So obviously some people will always push back. Some people recognize fetus as humanity. They'll even recognize them as persons, but then they'll make an argument akin to a self-defense argument.
Yeah.
That even though I'm a human, even though I'm a person, if I pose a threat to someone else's life, they could kill me with impunity to prevent that risk of harm, right? So they'll actually advance the self-defense argument in suggesting that all abortion, one abortion doctor I interact with a lot on Twitter has suggested that every single abortion is medically necessary as long as more women die in childbirth than from abortion. And debates about those statistics notwithstanding, notion that, I mean, there are some people who will always defend abortion.
Of course.
And I don't say they're wrong, and more power to them, but I don't think they should be using misinformation to basically trick those who would support fetal rights if they actually knew the facts as they are and not as they're being represented by those who obviously seek to distort those facts due to how threatening it is. And I mean, that's the reason why there was such a response to my research.
Of course.
I mean, it was actually proof of the Streisand effect, right? So in avoiding your destiny, you often find it. So in an attempt to stop my research or silence my research, they ended up giving me a big story that was of intrigue to people like the Daily Wire, Breitbart, One American News Network, all these people that covered me. And it was because it wasn't only interesting that I had the finding, it was interesting that they tried to stop me and they tried to end my career over it. And, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but to those who are listening, and, Rick Schwader, who did so much for me, and I'm still eternally grateful to him for supporting my research. He actually ended up saying that he wouldn't put his name on a document that would be cited by pro-life people. He ended up trying to stop my survey, and I had to replace him as my advisor with another committee member, which, that's another story. They could read about it in one of the articles, or I could come back on. But I mean, how sad is it that this person who was so fiercely fearless, and then even he got threatened enough that caused him to try to thwart my research. And he said he would recommend that I not graduate if I continued my research. At that time, I had only collected about 1,000 participants. And, I was very fortunate that somebody else stepped in, but I mean, the whole story around
amazing, right? I mean, and I say that as I know we're gonna be wrapping up here.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's fine. I think it's absolutely amazing because there's something there that it's difficult for people who are uninterested or apathetic about this argument. And when I get in front of audiences and try to explain to them, you have no idea how much of your life is impacted by this argument. You're blindly unaware of how many times your daily life is impacted by this greater argument that's going on, and the links to which these people will go to, the people, many of the people who are the hardcore disagreeers, they will go to protect what they see as this. It's a sacred thing to them, a sacred right. And
such a great word. Yeah.
What I find astonishing, because let's just take a moment and appreciate, there was a moment in this podcast where I stopped because I was absolutely in awe that there is a person of that prestige working at the university level that at any point would defend female genital mutilation. And that guy ultimately came to say, this is too hot for me, right? I'll stick with FGM being okay, but I'm not taking this line on abortion. If that doesn't communicate the insane pressure that is on people when they step out on this, I don't know what possibly could. That guy said, this is too much for me. I'll just stick with defending the indefensible, and I'm not touching this.
Not only too much for him, he said my research was unethical. He designed the research with me. He went over every jot and tittle of my surveys. We went over every word to make sure it was up to his standards. I sent it out to a bunch of people, right? He knew about it all along. And then he ends up coming to me and saying, he said it was unethical. And when I said, but if the ethics committee deemed it ethical, how can you say it's unethical? We designed this together, Rick. And he said that his ethical standards are higher than the IRB, which is the ethics committee at a university. And interestingly enough, months prior, he had written a really well-read article about how these ethics committees are squashing research, that they are actually overly onerous in their requirements, and that Socrates would roll around in his grave if he knew what the people who carried on his legacy, what graduate students had to do to ask simple questions in a survey. So here he had a public face that was saying ethics committees are too harsh, and then he said he's actually harsher. I mean, to say I was awestruck is an underestimate, an understatement. I mean, he wrote me in an email shortly after saying, you seemed distraught in our meeting. I was like, Rick, I mean, what am I supposed to, I'm flesh and blood. I mean, we had meetings where we like cried together. I mean,
it's insane what happens to otherwise reasonable people when the issue of abortion comes up.
And that's the point. I truly believe my experiences with him didn't say anything about him as a person. I believe he is a fearless researcher.
Yeah.
I think, and this is my my honest opinion. I think he's the best of us. I think he is a fearless person who believes in protecting truth, even when it flies in the face of his goals. It's just unfortunate that I reached his limits. Yeah. Because obviously he wouldn't have taken me on as a student. Well, but it goes to your point about just how threatening this question is.
Yeah.
That I was the one who bumped up against, his most sensitive area. And I mean, God only knows what he faced from people who said, why did you take this student on? Why would you support this pro-life movement? I mean, for all I know, and I actually have heard students who ended up coming back to me and saying that professors at my school are bad-mouthing me, and they're talking about me as a cautionary tale. And they were surprised. I've actually met some students since I graduated. They're like, I thought you were going to be so different. They said, like, you're a relatively nice guy. And they thought I was going to be some troll or some, like,
There is a valuable lesson here, though, by the way, because I have been around pro-life people for 10 years. And let me say that the way that you talk, not just the way that you write in your PhD thesis and the way that I read what you write and the way that you talk, even here today during this podcast, for example, when there is somebody for whom you have a disagreement, you have very graciously refused to name them. You allude to them, but you won't name them. You leave open the possibility of future relationships with people, even people that you perceive of having hurt you in the past. I mean, you are, in the language that you talk about the pro-life, pro-choice distinction, as gracious as anybody I've ever met in this conversation that we're having. And I guarantee you that there's going to be pro-life people out there that are irritated about how gracious you are and feeling like you need to be more, you need to confront it more strongly. And
Yeah.
yet, that is still too radical for them.
Yeah.
That's an amazing statement, right? I mean, the two things there, when you add those together, the incredible way that you did the best that you possibly could to not be exactly what they characterize the pro-life position as,
Hmm.
the careful way in which you proceeded to not play into the stereotypes that they have for people that believe in the value of human life, and the fact that you had a person who at one point in your story is a hero who steps in and makes all of this possible. And I say this knowing it might irritate somebody like him. Thank God that he he did this and aligned himself with you early on to get this
Yeah.
going. It's somebody who is got such academic boldness that they will defend what in my mind is indefensible, but they still see an avenue towards it, defense of it.
Hmm.
And even that guy ultimately says that's how hot abortion is. That's how hot this issue is.
Yeah.
You said you and what you did reached the limit of his ferocity, of his fierceness, of it, and so I think that that's a great moment for us just to stop. I'm going
Yeah.
to give you a moment to say, to wrap things up and to share your final thoughts with everybody. I would obviously love to have you back on, and we'll talk about other things in the future. But I think as just a summation, both the victory there, and that we have just great data now that you have done. And let me say again, thank you. And I want to say this because I just did a podcast last night about art and about beauty. And in
Mm.
it, I talked about how we undervalue how much work goes into creating beauty and creating art and creating
Yeah.
music and to writing. It's an act of will. It pushes up against frustration and disappointment. And ultimately, it's those artists and those people who create beauty, they work hard to do so.
Mm.
And we imagine these artists that are just effortlessly creating amazing things because they've been gifted by God, and that's just
Yeah.
not the creative process,
No.
right? And so that's another thing I really wanted to talk to you about, because my experience in reading about your story was that, and one of the messages I tell to people a lot is that when you're facing difficulties, the way through it is not magic, right? It's
Mm.
hard work.
Yeah.
It's nothing miraculous or magical that's going to happen here. What's going to happen is you're going to work the problem, you're going to work hard, you're going to persevere, and you're going to get to the end. And my friend, the end that you gave us with your research is a gift. It's a gift
Mm.
because it allows us to move on from one category and focus like a laser on another. Why do you think you're allowed to kill this category of human life? And that,
Yeah.
and to put them back onto that question. And so I just offer my deepest appreciation for what you've done. I love your story, man. And do you have anything you'd like to say before we wrap this up?
Yeah. I mean, that was so great what you described about that artistic process and the fact that there's no guarantee of success,
Yeah.
that you're going on this lark and it's because you're so moved. There really is no option. When people mention my determination, it it was just who I am, and I was on a trail and I had to follow it, and there was nothing that was going to stop me. And it didn't matter that everybody told me I was going to, jettison my career. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm just grateful that I've been able to land on my feet. I often joked about how, I might have to end up delivering DoorDash or driving Uber after this,
Uh-huh.
because I knew that I was taking big risks in being in the middle, because pro-lifers might not respond very well to my research and some of the ways in which I talk about the two sides. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't, dunk in the way that somebody would expect,
Yeah.
or would they would prefer me to do. So I just want to say that, I'm so blessed. I work for Illinois Right to Life as their program director, and I see myself as just a professional pro-lifer, a professional educator on the abortion debate. So whereas most people don't get to live their research, they just do it and then they move on. I'm very blessed in this season of my life that I'm able to continue doing this. And if it's God's will, I'll do it for the rest of my life in whatever capacity He'll allow for. But I just want to thank, not only you for covering my research, because again, if people don't talk about it, it's as if it doesn't exist.
That's right.
So truly, you using that message, you encouraging me, I mean, it means the world to me. And all of your viewers, I want them to all know, everybody, that, I see myself as a servant to you. I'm blessed with the opportunity to be a professional pro-lifer. And to whatever extent I can to help you understand these more nuanced issues of the abortion debate, or, to give a talk, do things like this. I mean, you talked about giving talks with We Dignify. I found myself one day after a long 12-hour day of work, and then I was getting in my car on a freezing Chicago day to drive a half hour to go give a talk for free. Whereas all my friends making tons of money
Yes.
as attorneys, they say, like, why would you do anything for it? But it's like, it's not about that. Like, any opportunity, I've given talks where there's 3 people, and I appreciated it just as much as when there was 100 people.
That's right.
And any opportunity I have to use this research that I was able to do, or whatever talents I've been given, I'm appreciative for the opportunity. So I'm here for everybody in the movement to be used as they see fit.
Yeah, and the idea of speaking to small audiences, by the way, I believe that if I remember the numbers correctly, that Greg Cunningham, when he came to town one time out there in the LA area to speak to a bunch of youth pastors and pastors, he ended up having an audience of 3 when he was working for Center for Bioethical Reform, one of those being Scott Klusendorf. And for that changed my life, because Scott impacted me in my life. I mean, I was just talking to Scott the other night. It's difficult for him to understand how many of us are walking in his footsteps. So and thank you for your time. Thank you for your generosity. Let me say this as just the close. One of the things I say a lot is that to win this discussion, we don't just need good arguments. We need good arguments from good arguers. And so having had this opportunity to talk to you, man, you fall into that category for me. You are a good arguer, and God bless you, and thank you, man.
Thank you so much, Jay.